everyone, check this out. In 1839, a German pirate turned miner came to Texas with 10 jackloads of gold and silver and buried them somewhere within the state of Texas. Now, a jackload is around 80 pounds, and 10 jackloads is 800 pounds of precious metals. So let's say that there was 300 pounds of gold and 500 pounds of silver. In today's money, that would be approximately $176,000 in silver and $8.6 million in gold. How do we know that this was buried, and where's the general location of this treasure? We will reveal all of that today on this episode of The Adventure Guide. So the person that buried the gold, his name was Carl Steinheimer, or Carl Steinham. He was born around 1793 in Speyer, Germany. At the age of 11, he ran away from home, became a shipmate on a naval vessel, and ended up in the Americas where he became a pirate. In 1810, the U.S. Constitution made it illegal to import any more slaves into the United States. Carl Steinheimer took advantage of this. He formed a friendship with a man named Ori, and together they began to smuggle slaves into the U.S. for sale at a high dollar. They used the island of Galveston as their base of operations, until 1817 when their partnership split. Steinheimer ended up going to Mexico, where it's rumored he engaged in mining. Other stories have Steinheimer still engaged in piracy. It's during this time period in Mexico that the only legal document with Carl Steinheimer's name on it surfaces. In the 1830s, a man came to power in Mexico. He overthrew the Constitution and established himself as a dictator. His name was Santa Anna. Mexico went up in arms and rebellion, and Santa Anna crushed every last bit of it except for one little area in the northeast of the country, Texas. He marched an army into Texas, and he was soundly defeated. Texas won its independence and created its own republic, known simply as the Republic of Texas. However, in 1839, Mexico began plotting on how to take Texas back, and chief among these plots was something called the Cordova Rebellion. There was a man named Manuel Flores, and he was in charge of inciting the Native Americans inside of Texas to take up arms and overthrow the Texas government. Now, he couldn't get wagons of firearms in there, so he had to take gold and silver. There's two different stories of the origin of the gold and silver that's buried by Carl Steinheimer. The most popular one is that Carl Steinheimer was a miner. He had acquired all this gold and silver through hard work. During this Cordova Rebellion, word reached Carl Steinheimer that the love of his life had moved from either Louisiana or Europe to St. Louis in Missouri. Steinheimer decided to give up the mining, take what gold and silver he had, and go straight to St. Louis to pursue her hand in marriage. However, between St. Louis and Texas, there was a lot of hostile tribes. When Steinheimer got word that Manuel Flores was taking an expedition into Texas, he asked if he could tag along for safety. Flores agreed, so Steinheimer hired two hands to help him get these 10 jackloads of gold and silver up to St. Louis. Steinheimer and Flores' expedition set off in the early part of May in 1839. Along the way, they encountered 4 surveyors and they killed them, which gained the attention of the Texas Rangers. And on May 19th, they were discovered near Liberty Hill, Texas, just north of Austin. The Texas Rangers attacked. However, Steinheimer, with his 10 jackloads of gold and silver, just waltzed right off the field. And this is what leads to the second theory, that was never Steinheimer's gold and silver, that was Mexico's money sent to bribe the Indians, and Steinheimer had plotted this ambush and took off with the money. Whichever the two stories is true, the skirmish at Liberty Hill 100% happened, and there is a historical marker there today. Steinheimer was in serious trouble. They were in hostile Indian territory. The Texas Rangers were going to be on his trail any moment, and all their Indian allies that had come along with him on the expedition had scattered and knew that he had this gold and silver, and they certainly were going to be coming for it. These 10 donkeys were traveling so slow, and they were laden down with all this heavy gold and silver. They were trampling a path that a 5-year-old could follow. There was no way they were going to escape. So after traveling about 35 miles to the northeast, they knew they had to hurry up and bury all of the gold and silver. So they dug a hole and they tossed all the bags of gold and silver into it. except for one that Steinheimer threw on his horse. Then Steinheimer walked about 40 feet away and drove a large brass spike into a tree. After this, they took off in a southeast direction instead of northeast toward St. Louis. Now, we'll come back to this burial site later on in the video, but for now, we're going to continue on with Steinheimer's journey. They traveled for about 9 to 10 miles till they came to what's known as the Three Knobs, just outside of Rogers, Texas. There, the trio decided to go up on top of a hill where they could scout and scan the countryside into what direction they wanted to go from there. And unfortunately, being on top of that hill, they were spotted by a war party. And they all saw this war party coming towards them. Steinheimer jumped off his horse, he dug a shallow hole, he threw that last bag of gold in there, reached in, pulled out 6 coins, covered it up, and then they tried to make their escape. However, Lady Fortune just didn't smile on them. Both of his followers were killed, and Steinheimer took an arrow to the leg. He did manage to escape, and he traveled a few days, relatively easy with no complications, and he came across a traveling party headed toward St. Louis. They tended to Steinheimer's wounds and offered to let him travel with them, and he did so, and a few days into the travel, he began to get a rank smell from his leg. It was a gangrenous smell. Steinheimer knew he was going to die. Knowing his fate, Steinheimer scribed a farewell letter to his sweetheart. He folded it close and sealed it with wax. And then he asked the group that if they would please deliver this letter after his death, that they could keep these 6 gold coins in good faith. They agreed to do so. Shortly after Steinheimer died, they buried him, and off they went to St. Louis. They delivered the letter in good faith just as they'd promised. When his sweetheart opened the letter, she was absolutely stunned by what she was reading. Not only did this letter contain his parting words of love, but it contained a map and this detailed account of this treasure that he had buried. He wrote about the bag of gold that he buried on top of the hill at the Three Knobs, and he also spoke of this large cache that they had buried. He told her not far from there that she would find the confluence of 3 rivers, or where 3 rivers form into one. Once they found this location, they were to start looking around for the brass spike, and once they found that brass spike, they would be within 40 feet of the gold and silver. Unfortunately, this part of Texas was just too crazy and wild for her to go search for that gold. She had to wait for another 10 years before she could do so. Once the frontier had pushed further west into Texas, and it was safe enough to go look for this gold and silver, she did so with a large number of her family members. They arrived in Waco, and they hired a few locals that knew the area to help them search for the treasure. As soon as they mentioned the confluence of 3 rivers, the locals knew exactly where to go. The location was without a doubt where the Leon, the Salado, and the Lampasas rivers meet together to form the Little River. And this is just to the west of Little River Academy, Texas. So even though they had the right location for sure, they had spent 6 months looking for that brass spike, but could never find it. And without finding the brass spike, they couldn't find the treasure. Well, the problem was, after 10 years, the tree bark grew around the brass spike and it could no longer be seen. Eventually, they ran out of funding and had to return to St. Louis. They never returned again. However, there were some of the locals that had searched for this thing, and they too had never found it. Then around the 1940s, a professor showed up in the area, and he'd pieced together a bunch of information, and he was sure he knew where it was at. At this time, the land belonged to a judge that he suspected the treasure was on. So he went to the judge, and he said, "I'm pretty sure that this treasure is actually right under your house." And the judge said he was not willing to risk destroying his home to look for the possibility of a treasure. So the professor thought for a little bit, and he's like, "No, actually, I think it's over by that pecan tree." And so by moonlight, they began to dig it up. All this activity got the attention of the local newspapers, and they came out and found out about the whole story of Steinheimer and his gold, and about this brass spike, and they reported it in the newspaper. A few days later, an old-timer shows up with really important news. He told them that many years ago, after a long winter of burning firewood, that as he cleaned out the ashes, he found a brass spike just like the one they described in the newspaper. The good news is that since he found the brass spike, that means the story's true and that the treasure's really there. The bad news for them was, at the time, they didn't have the technology like metal detectors to look for the treasure. To this day, the treasure has still not been found, and it's laying out there somewhere in the general area. Now remember, before going out to search for this treasure, never enter someone's land without permission. Also, if you see purple paint on trees in Texas, that's the same thing as a no trespassing sign. Never go past purple paint. Alright guys, that's going to do it for this episode of the Adventure Guide. I hope you enjoyed yourself. Make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. And if you go out there to look for it, good luck. And until next time, we're off on another adventure. God bless.